Okay, so for those that have had intro to crime, there should be a little bit of review. If you have not had intro to crime, we're going to talk a little bit about what we know in terms of how much crime there is in the United States and how we know that. Like, what are the methods? And the main point here for a class on crime in the media is, or really for any class I teach, is I want you guys to understand sort of that there is no kind of mystery, no way to hide things or distort things if you understand where that data comes from and how to think about that data. So we have three major ways to figure out how much crime there is in any place. In the U.S., our official source of data that we collect every year is something called the Uniform Crime Reports, or the UCR data. And the UCR data is collected by individual police departments all across the country. And the vast majority of police departments do collect data and compile it and submit it. They submit it to the FBI, and the FBI collects, compiles, and puts out the same report every year called Crime in the United States. So usually when you hear any media report about crime going up or down or how much crime there is, it comes from this UCR data. And so in the UCR are what's called offenses recorded by police. So for it to be in the UCR, presumably a crime has to happen. Somebody has to take the time to report that crime to the police, or police have to uncover it while they're out in the streets. And then somebody from the police department has to make a report and record that as a crime. So the information gets recorded as what crime it is, and the other thing in the UCR is information on everybody who gets arrested and for what crime they got arrested, and some basic information about who they are, age, race, and demographics. The major upside of the UCR data is that we collect the same information every year, and we've been doing so since, for some instances, the early 1900s. So in terms of crime trends, it's really good data to compare year to year to see what's going on with crime. The major drawback to the UCR data is that it's filtered, so to speak, through the police departments. So there's a lot of crime that happens that does not get reported to the police. A lot of crimes that people don't think are serious enough to report. You have crimes like partner violence that people, or rape or sexual assault, that people are afraid to report to the police or ashamed, they don't want to report to the police. So for a variety of reasons, crime doesn't get reported to the police. And that's the so-called dark figure of crime, crime that we don't know about because it doesn't get reported. The major way to kind of check on that and get around that is to collect information from the general public. So victimization surveys gets a random sample of people from the public and asks them, in the past 6 months, have you been a victim of X, Y, and Z crime? So that data is collected by the Bureau of Justice Statistics, and some other federal agencies are involved. And they phone and in person-to-person interview people. The big upside is it's like the UCR. We get national level crime data, so it's a more or less a random sample of United States citizens, and so from that we can actually estimate the number of crimes that have happened in a year. So if you want to know how many burglaries actually happened, the NCVS data is going to be a better guess than the Uniform Crime Reports, because there's a lot of people that get burgled that don't report it to the police. So we can use, and often we do, we use both the Uniform Crime Reports and the NCVS to track crime over time. And to the extent they agree, it gives us a lot more confidence that we know crime is going up or going down. The big downside of NCVS is that there's crimes it can't measure. The big one is homicide. Obviously, the victim is dead. So unless you can communicate with the dead, you can't interview somebody about whether they've been a victim of homicide. So there's other crimes. I think the so-called victimless crimes. So think about drug use, right? Like you call somebody up, hey, have you been a victim of cocaine use in the past 6 months? It doesn't make sense. Yeah, right now. So that sort of crime, prostitution, drug use, illegal gambling, those sorts of things aren't going to be able to be assessed by the NCVS. And for those sorts of crimes, our best is self-report data. Unfortunately, in the U.S., we don't really have an ongoing national level self-report crime survey that we can compare to other two sources. In self-report, we ask people, have you committed crimes? So have you committed X, Y, and Z crimes? And usually those are sort of mom and pop researchers go out, collect their own data because they want to know something about crime. But in terms of sort of assessing nationwide trends, it's not really, with the exception, which I'll show you, is drug use. We do have a survey called Monitoring the Future that's been done since the 70s that every year asks a sample of high school students about their drug and alcohol and cigarette use. So obviously I have to do this before I can get your data, so I can get ahead a little bit in the class. But I can probably guesstimate what you guys are going to say. Although, if a chunk of you have been intro to crim, hopefully you know that this isn't true. But every year I ask my intro to crim classes, and that's what this data comes from, is do you think crime is worse or better? Is violence more or less prevalent in the U.S. over the past 25, 30 years? As the chart shows, between 50 and 70% of students think that things are getting worse. I suspect that this leap here has to do with the sort of recent politicization of crime again. It sort of waxes and wanes how much politicians talk about crime, but in the last presidential election cycle, it became a big issue again. So most people think in the U.S., and students aren't alone, most citizens think crime is getting worse. How do we know? Well, so here's the UCR long-term trend on homicides in the United States. And you can see it's sort of waxed and waned. We've had peaks that happened in the 1930s, in the 1960s, and in the 1980s, and then in the early 1990s, where we've gotten as high as 10 per 100,000. So all UCR data is expressed per 100,000. Human beings tend not to be great with really small numbers or small percent. So you think, I always tell students this, you think of the size of the Duluth Superior area is roughly 100,000 people. So if we were to be at the national level for homicide, and the high end, we would have experienced about 10 homicides per year, and the low end about 5 homicides per year. This, by the way, is the 9/11 terrorist attacks, which raises a bit of an issue for people who are using this data. Like, does it count in terms of trying to predict homicide rates and whether things are going up and down? Obviously, it becomes sort of a big anomaly. On the other hand, it did happen, and these all were homicides. So in this data, obviously, it's included. In some data, it's not. It depends on the purpose. So this is a long-term trend going back all the way to the 1900s. Here's a more sort of detailed chart about homicide since the 1950s. But the big point here that you see both in this chart right here, going down here, and this chart all the way down here, is that our serious violence rate in general, homicide rate, has all sort of dropped pretty dramatically since the early 1990s. So we sort of had our last big peak around 90 to 92. And since then, I mean, you look back historically, I don't think a lot of people would guess that our homicide rates right now are about what they were in like the 1950s. But that's the case. Homicide, like other serious violent crimes and property crime, has been dropping for 25 and 30 years in some cases. So again, in terms of a media class, and we'll talk more about this in detail, but politically, if you're trying to sort of drum up support that people are afraid of crime and that they want to vote for you because you can straighten out crime, it is true that in 2015, which is a year after this right here, homicide did increase. And it is true that year-to-year increase, it was the biggest increase in 45 years. Taken out of context, that, wow, it makes it seem like, holy cow, homicide must be going through the roof. The reality is it went from 4.4 to 4.9. So it went from right about here, 4.4.5, up to right about here, which is still less than it was, in 2006 and 2008. So yeah, it did. I mean, the numbers actually right. It was the biggest increase, but the real reason that it was the biggest increase in decades was that largely homicide's been going down for decades. And so any increase of any size would be the biggest one in a very long time. So we'll hit more on sort of what this means in a bit. So this is NCVS data. This is per 1,000 people. So this is violent crime, which would include assault, robbery, assault. Oh, there's a third one, rape, sexual assault. So again, the vast majority of those are going to be assaults and simple assaults where somebody doesn't get seriously hurt. But this mirrors, so you think of that crime drop you saw in homicide, it's the same era right there. That crime is showing a big drop in NCVS data. So this is an example where UCR data and NCVS data tell us the same thing, which gives us confidence that there's a real sort of big crime drop that's happened in 25, 30 years. Property crime has basically been going down as long as we can measure it in NCVS data. So this is when the NCVS starts. That trend has continued downward. So property crime has seen a real big decline since the 1970s. Obviously, what I've shown you is national level data. And this is all back to UCR data. So these are crimes reported to the police. There's our national homicide rate in 2015. You'll notice that Minnesota, which is down below, is roughly half of the national average for homicide. Substantially lower for robbery, substantially lower for aggravated assault. This is probably a good example right here of understanding your data source. So, right, this is crimes reported to the police. It doesn't make much sense that we'd be safer in terms of homicide, robbery, and aggravated assault, but less safe in terms of rape. I suspect what's going on here is that Minnesota is pretty progressive in terms of how we support women who are survivors of rape and sexual assault. And so that our reporting rates are going to be higher than in other states. And so we're going to look worse, but actually it's probably a good thing that our reporting rates are higher. So, I mean, I suspect that's true because every other indicator of violence is a lot lower. It wouldn't make sense that we stick out in one category of violence but no other one. So it's a good example of sort of thinking about your data and being careful about, drawing conclusions that aren't necessarily true. So property crimes I showed you in the last, they've decreased. Oh, yes, it's 2015. So 2015 is the first year in a few years that the data's gotten a bit murky, that it's not clear, it's not consistent across all crimes. Property crime is consistent. Both the UCR and NCVS showed declines again, and so for things like burglary and theft, we're at really historic lows, lower than the 1950s, 60s kind of thing. Violence, it depended on the source. So in the UCR data, violent crime ticked up 3%. In NCVS data, it went down pretty substantially. Why the difference? So one of the articles on there sort of examines where that big difference comes from. And in both the violent crime rate here and the UCR violent crime rate, the big driver is going to be aggravated assault. So for the UCR data, the serious violent crime index is rape, robbery, and aggravated assault and homicide. And the most prevalent crime is going to be aggravated assault. So the suspicion is that police have become sort of more sensitive to classifying assaults as aggravated, more likely to classify them that way. And you can get at that because one of the things we ask in NCVS data is, did you report this to police? And that hasn't changed much. So the aggravated results reported to police hasn't changed, but the ones they record have changed. So the answer seems to be that they're more likely to record an assault as an aggravated assault, which would sort of drive up the data. One place we're sure that violence did go up and which I talked about a bit earlier, is homicide, and that goes up from 4.4 to 4.88 per 100,000 people. And if you sort of disaggregate that data, almost all of that increase is like a chunk of 10 big cities. So like Chicago, Washington, D.C., Baltimore, and some other places. Why that is, whether it's going to continue, whether this is a trend, nobody who's honest about it really knows. You're going to have to wait for another 2 years. I mean, if you look at the data back here, right? So we had increases here, we had increases here, and what happened? All of a sudden, it went back, started this downward trend again. So we don't know right now. In the U.S., 4.9 is still pretty low. Not necessarily in other countries, but so we got to wait and see what happens. All right. So just to give you a sort of overall sense, this is the UCR Violent Crime Index. So again, since the 90s, it's been going way down. Here's the last sort of year where we had an uptick. And again, this is a great example of, yeah, it's the first uptick, the biggest uptick. It's bigger than this one here. It's bigger than this one here. It's the biggest one in over 30 years because crime's been going down for that long. So this is the NCVS data, which shows more of a continuous drop. And again, I mean, the overall trend lines, if you look at them, are pretty much the same. We're sort of disagreeing over, they disagree, those data sources, over this last year. So we know that crime's been going down for almost 30 years now. But Americans' perception of crime has never really accurately matched what's going on. Well, I shouldn't say never, because for a bit it did here. So this dark green line is every year we ask people in America, the Gallup poll asks them, do you think crime and violence is worse or better than or about the same as last year? And this is the top is the percent of Americans that think it's getting worse. The bottom line is the actual victimization rate. So you'd expect in sort of a rational world that these lines would match, that as violence actually goes down, that people would say, I think things are better, that things are getting better. And it did happen for a little bit. I suspect what's happening here is that, when crime started to decline back in the early 90s, it was pretty big news that crime was going down, and that a lot of newspapers reported on it, a lot of people talked about it. And so for a while, people actually felt safer. What happened here? This is 9/11, terrorist attacks. And since then, there's been this sort of increasing perception of violence, despite the fact that in reality, violence has gone down. So that's what we know about, and again, it's great sort of fodder for what we're going to talk about in terms of crime and media. That a big reason why this gap exists is that coverage of violent crimes, especially serious violent crimes, especially homicide, during a period when crime actually went down, coverage of homicides actually went up substantially. And so you're talking about an era when 24-hour cable news, CNN, Fox News, MSNBC, that spend a lot of time covering homicides. Well, yeah, people are going to think things are getting worse. So that gets us to this issue of how the media portrays crime in the criminal justice system. And so I asked you guys, I've asked classes, I'll ask you guys about this. We'll talk about this when we talk about Scared Straight. The one I asked you guys was right here. So recently we've been sort of saturated with media coverage of Black Lives Matter and of sort of violence towards police, people angry at police, people sort of ambushing police. So most Americans think the job of policing has gotten more dangerous, that police officers are more likely to get killed. And so here's data from my intro to crim students. I don't know where you guys are going to shake out on this. But again, here's the actual data. So long-term trend, has been a pretty big drop in police officers killed feloniously, so attacked, as opposed to in car accidents and other stuff. People killed feloniously. So, we're down to a point now where police officers generally have a sort of lower homicide, on-the-job homicide rate than average American males. So per 100,000, what's the homicide rate for adult males? That it's dropped to the point where police officers are, at worst, no different from the typical males in that age range. So, all right. So there's obviously a pretty big gap between what people think about crime and what's actually going on with crime for a lot of instances. The other one is drug use, and so drugs has come on and off, and we'll talk about this. We have these sort of drug panics in the United States. Back in the 20s, it was marijuana and LSD, then marijuana again, and cocaine, then methamphetamine. Now we're in the heroin. And so, media coverage kind of shines a light and then takes it away on certain issues, including drug use. So we do have data source for that, as I said. There's a couple of them. The biggest one is this monitoring the future data. And so monitoring the future is a survey done with high school kids every year. And so they have data on, I think it's eighth graders up through seniors in high school. And so we have this consistent since the 1970s data on drug use. And so, you can track pretty easily on the web anything you want to track in terms of drug use. So let's see, marijuana continues to rise among teens. Let's look at it. So here are the trends in marijuana use. This is actual use level. So you can see it like had its big heyday in the late 70s. Plummeted down. This is about when I graduated high school here, was at a low, and now it's sort of going back up. Obviously, it's become legal in some states for people over 21, and attitudes about marijuana have changed. Although, ironically, here's the disapproval. So it asks people, how bad is this drug? Do you disapprove of it? How hard is it to get? And you see those things sort of wax and wane as well. Aside from marijuana and a couple other drugs, let's see, various drugs. So we're off to a table in our graph, but the prevalence rates for things like LSD, hallucinogens, PCP, cocaine, have all remained pretty low over the years. So less than 10% of folks, crack cocaine, heroin, all those drugs, the sort of hard drugs, so to speak, are pretty rare among high school students. So, but you can track them and see how they wax and wane in that sense. So, what do we know about crime in the United States? Crime has fluctuated a great deal. We've had peaks in the 30s, in the 60s, in the 80s, in the 90s. Crime policy, in terms of what we do about crime, really had in the U.S. a really big sort of dramatic turning point in the 70s, and that related to, which we'll talk about, related to ideology, related to actual crime increases, but our reaction to that and our reaction to kind of the tumult of the 60s. And so one of the things that's sort of changed dramatically in the 70s was our use of incarceration. So this is the number of inmates we have locked up per 100,000 people, and you can see for a very long time it was pretty much the same. So prison use and population increased roughly the same, so that there's always about 100 individuals in prison per 100,000 folks. So you can see this huge increase. And so people talk about mass incarceration. and use of prison. We now have over 2 million people locked up, and so you imagine superimposing this on a chart of crime. Crime's gone up and down all over in here. It wasn't that crime just went up, and so more people ended up in prison. It was that we had a big debate that was sort of a mix of ideology and politics and media coverage that resulted in a drastic change on how we treat offenders. So that's been one of the big stories that we'll talk about, which gets us to the U.S. versus other countries. Why do we have so many people in prison compared to other people? How do we even know? So the most reliable sort of measure of crime that we can compare ourselves to other countries with is homicide. So most countries track homicide in roughly the same way. Since the 80s, some of our companion countries have started national crime victimization surveys of their own. And so now we have data to compare our country with other countries in terms of things that aren't homicide, so assaults, thefts, those sorts of issues. And so the U.S., I can't remember what the next slide is. Conventional wisdom was, before we had this data right here, all we could look at was homicide rates. And it turns out the U.S. does stick out. We have an exceptionally high homicide rate when you compare us to other industrialized countries. So countries like Canada, Great Britain, and Australia tend to hover around 1 to 2 homicides per 100,000 people, whereas the U.S. at our low point now is like 4.8, so 2 to 5 times higher than other countries. Japan has a homicide rate of less than 1. It's like 0.5 per 100,000. So before we had data on other crimes, the conventional wisdom was the one crime we know, homicide, is so much worse. Other crimes probably worse. Turns out that's not necessarily true. That for the most part, the U.S. is sort of middle of the pack. We have lower property crime rates than other countries. We have maybe slightly higher violence than other countries, but no means are we exceptional. As I said, the one difference is homicide, that we have exceptionally high homicide rates when you compare us to other countries. In terms of incarceration, why are our prison rates so high? Well, part of it is that connects to our higher rates of very serious violent crime, especially homicide. But it also connects to the fact that we decided to kind of use prison for property offenders, so for burglars and thieves and drug offenders, and whereas other countries don't do that. So we put more people in prison than we put them there for longer times for those sorts of crimes. And so the combination of those two things really drove up our incarceration rates over the past 30 years. Why do we kill each other at such a high rate? There's a variety of hypotheses. I suspect some of it's wrapped up into this. So our gun homicide rates are a lot higher in the U.S. than other countries, so 7 to 15 times higher. And so it seems pretty obvious that gun availability has something to do with it. Having said that, it's got to be more than just guns, because we kill each other, aside from guns, with non-weapon. We kill each other without using weapons 2 to 3 times more than other countries. So it probably has something to do with guns, but it also has to do with other sorts of things. So there are sort of other issues. One of the other ways the U.S. stands out from other countries is our high levels of inequality. So the U.S. is an outlier in terms of economic inequality between the very wealthy and the very poor, and for homicide rates. And so some people have said, well, it makes sense that those two things are connected. We experienced, in the 80s and 90s, this sort of violence that was associated with the crack use in the inner cities that drove up a lot of homicide rates, and that's sort of subsided a bit now. So, nobody knows for sure. One of the reasons I stay employed as a criminologist is that there's still these sorts of puzzles to figure out. We're not entirely sure why violence plummeted in the 90s. As we'll talk about later, a lot of folks were arguing that the 90s and 2000s were going to be a bloodbath based on previous trends and other demographics. Why did it turn around and plummet? Nobody knows. I would say sort of be careful of simple explanations. So you'll hear people say, well, yeah, we built a bunch of prisons, we locked up a bunch of thugs, and now crime went down. Well, not all states did that, right? So Minnesota didn't build a ton of prisons and lock people up, but we still experienced a big crime drop. So it has to be more than just incarceration. It has to be, it's probably a variety of factors. So one of the articles on the website, if I remember right, on the Moodle site, is sort of a Q&A about whether crime went down. So again, it's just a sort of intro into sort of what we know about crime and how we know it, just to lay the groundwork for things we're going to talk about in the future.